Do I?
Committee will come to order. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The House Armed Services Committee meets to receive testimony from outside experts on the P5+1 negotiations over Iran's nuclear program and its implications for United States defense. Today we have with us Mr. William Toby, Mr. Michael Singh, and Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Our witnesses have an immense amount of experience working Iran issues, and we appreciate them sharing their perspectives with us today. I'm concerned that the scope of negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program was flawed from the outset. We know that Iran would be allowed to keep its nuclear capabilities, ability to enrich, and breakout capability. We know that Iran has had and may continue to have undeclared sites. We know that there are military dimensions to Iran's nuclear program that it refuses to address. And we know that the nuclear program is but one facet of Iran's overall grand strategy, which includes its sponsorship of terrorism, the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East, and other conventional military capabilities that continue to threaten the region and beyond. Yet none of these issues appear to be within scope of the comprehensive deal. Our ally Israel has called this a bad deal. Our friends and allies in the region have both publicly and privately conveyed their deep reservations about this deal. I worry that the President wants to achieve a nuclear deal with Iran at almost any cost. Some will argue that this deal is better than no deal and that it would slow down Iran's nuclear program. But how much time does it really buy us? International sanctions, which took a decade to put into place, were finally starting to bite. Had the administration maintained a strong regional presence, Congress, robust sanctions, and a clear resolve to use the military options necessary, we could have set the conditions for Iran to change its strategic calculus. Yet through these negotiations, we've done the opposite. In fact, Iran already thinks that the P5+1 have legitimized its nuclear enrichment capability, thereby validating its nuclear calculus. The American public is understandably war-weary. I do not desire to go to war with Iran either, and that is precisely why I'm concerned about the administration's approach in these negotiations. If the administration signs on to a comprehensive deal that legitimizes Iran's capability to enrich and that does not dismantle the nuclear program as well as the arsenal surrounding Iran's nuclear program, I fear that a future president may have to seriously contemplate taking military action to enforce such a deal or to protect our allies in the region. This is the worst possible outcome. This is a very serious and complicated issue, and again, I thank our expert panel for being here today, and I look forward to their testimony and insights. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, let me just say, if in fact the United States agrees to the kind of deal that the Chairman just described, then I think it would be a grave and terrible mistake. But what you just described bears no resemblance whatsoever that I can see to what I've heard we are trying to accomplish. And let me be clear on one point. Without question, Iran's a bad actor, independent of the nuclear issue. Since 1979, they've been pretty much nothing but a bad actor on a lot of different issues, and we will have to confront that no matter what. Whether we get a nuclear deal or not, Iran is going to continue to be a challenge and continue to be a threat that we have to measure and contain. But the question, the calculus that we've made is, are we better off with that Iranian threat if we can take the nuclear piece of it off the table? And there's no question about it. Iran is terrible. Iran with a nuclear weapon would be, a much, much more difficult situation to deal with. So any steps that we can take to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon, I think, are important. And the sanctions regime has, in fact, been working. It drove them to the table. It drove them to the table because of the impact that it has had on their economy, which has been devastating. And I am well aware of what Iran wants. What Iran wants is they would love to be able to get a nuclear weapon without international condemnation. That's what they would love to figure out. But unfortunately for them, unfortunately for us, that's not going to happen. If they pursue the nuclear path, there will be sanctions and there will be huge economic consequences, as there already have been. Point number one, we did not lift those sanctions in the interim agreement. It was a very, very small piece that was given to them. All of the sanctions put in place are still there. It's still having this impact on the economy. It gives Iran an incentive to come to the table. Now, if they come to the table and don't offer something that gives us confidence that they will not develop a nuclear weapon, then we shouldn't take the deal. Absolutely. But pursuing these negotiations is the logical extension of sanctions. If we say to Iran, look, no matter what you do, no matter what you say, we're simply going to keep sanctioning you, then we give an incentive to just go ahead and build a nuclear weapon. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that I've heard in this debate, and I'd be interested in hearing your comments on it, everybody says that Iran is hell-bent to get a nuclear weapon, that they've made that decision, they're working towards it, and that simply isn't true. And the reason I know that's not true is because back in 2005, I was told that Iran was 6 months from having a bomb. And I believe that's true. I think they've been 6 months from having a bomb for 9 years. They have chosen not to build one. Why? Why? Because of the sanctions, because of what they're concerned about. So there is absolutely an opportunity to stop them from going down that road. Now, it's not easy, and I will evaluate this agreement based on whether or not it truly does stop them. But we have to at least try. And I'd be very interested from our witnesses today, what is the minimum in a negotiated agreement that we need? Now, I'll tell you, you can't unring the bell. There is no agreement that is going to make us positive that under no circumstances, never, ever, ever will Iran pursue a nuclear weapon again. But there are things that we can do that will significantly take down their enrichment, that will put in place a coercive inspections regime that will give us confidence that they're not building secret facilities. And if we can get that agreement that will tell us that we're going to know if Iran breaks it, then I think that's worth doing to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. It's a difficult thing, and I will close by one thing. I'm not optimistic. I am not optimistic that Iran will be willing to give up what they need to give up in order to get this deal. And if that comes to pass, we'll have to continue with the sanctions regime. We'll have to continue trying to discourage them in that way. But I think it's folly not to at least pursue it, to see if we can take the nuclear weapon off the table and deal with Iran on these other issues, as we've dealt with them before. The choice here isn't, we can force Iran to give up all of their bad behavior. I wish that option was on the table. The choice here is, can we take a realistic step that's going to stop them, continue to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon. And that's what I want to hear our witnesses talk about. What are those specifics that we're going to need to have in your estimation to give us that confidence? And then what your level of optimism is about, whether or not we can reach this agreement, and whether or not Iran is truly serious about it. I yield back. Look forward to testimony.
Thank you. Mr. Tobey.
Chairman McKean, Ranking Member Smith, it's a privilege to testify on a matter of surpassing importance. Preventing Iran from attaining a nuclear weapon is a matter of vital national security interest to the United States. Should we be satisfied with a deal that simply pushes Iran from 2 months to 6 months away from the nuclear threshold? Or should we expect more, that is, evidence of a fundamental decision not to pursue nuclear weapons? Last April, Secretary of State Kerry noted that Iran had reached a point perhaps only 2 months away from being able to produce sufficient fissile material to fabricate a nuclear weapon, and raised the possibility of pushing that timetable back 6 to 12 months. Accepting a situation in which Iran insists on keeping a loaded weapon on the table, but simply moves its finger farther from the trigger, would not appear to offer sound prospects for long-term success. If Iran has not made a fundamental decision to forswear nuclear weapons in return for better relations with other nations, Tehran will work to erode the firebreak by means overt and covert. And we have seen this situation in the past in North Korea. How can we judge whether or not Tehran has made such a fundamental decision, and how might we ensure that it endures? Satisfaction on 3 points would provide such insight, and just as important, offer the means to verify compliance or to detect cheating. These 3 potential elements of an agreement focus on preventing covert activities. They are resolving concerns regarding possible military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program, comprehensive monitoring of nuclear-related procurement and manufacturing, and enhanced authorities for the International Atomic Energy Agency. The first and most important step to ensure that Iran's nuclear weapons activities have truly ceased and will not restart is to get to the bottom of what the International Atomic Energy Agency calls possible military dimensions to Iran's nuclear program. Who did what, when, and where? The declaration can be verified by personnel files, invoices, manifests, inventories, disposition records, equipment, and buildings. The IAEA will construct a mosaic of the Iranian program. Some tiles will be missing, others might be fake, but the best way to understand the program and to ensure that it has stopped is to have as complete a picture as possible to identify and resolve inconsistencies. The November 2013 interim agreement calls for a joint commission to facilitate resolution of past and present issues of concern. The White House fact sheet on the deal contends that this includes possible military dimensions of the Iranian nuclear program, but such an outcome is by no means assured. The second step to guard against resurgence of a covert Iranian nuclear weapons program would be to authorize the IAEA to monitor comprehensively all nuclear-related and dual-use procurements by Iran to ensure that they are used solely at declared facilities. Credible information on undeclared nuclear procurements could be considered prima facie evidence that Iran is violating the agreement. As a part of this process, the IAEA will also need to monitor related production within Iran. A third step to guard against resurgence of a covert Iranian nuclear weapons program would be to enhance the powers of the IAEA beyond the additional protocol. Evidence of the non-proliferation treaty cheating is often subtle, taking the form of inconsistencies and irregularities. The IAEA must have ongoing authorities to pursue these anomalies should they arise, including access to documents, people, and facilities. These terms, getting to the bottom of possible military dimensions, comprehensive procurement monitoring, and enhanced authorities for the IAEA, cannot guarantee Iran's compliance with a deal to block its pursuit of nuclear weapons. They can, however, test Tehran's willingness to abide by a deal and even as the negotiations proceed, and if a deal is concluded, act as a deterrent to those who might seek to cheat on it. Would insisting on these terms be worth risking the possibility of no deal? Mr. Chairman, given the stakes invoked in the Iranian nuclear issue, we cannot afford a situation in which Tehran pretends to comply and we pretend to believe it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Singh.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee, it's an honor to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. The Iran nuclear negotiations are often reduced to a set of technical issues, such as breakout time, inspection regimes, and so forth. Those are vitally important issues, and my colleague here on the panel covered them, I think, very well, some of them. But I think it would be a mistake to view any agreement as primarily or merely technical, because any agreement is going to have profound strategic implications for the United States, for good or for ill. And what makes a deal a good deal or a bad deal, I think, needs to be measured not just in terms of breakout time, but in terms of how it advances or sets back American interests in the Middle East and beyond. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think needs to be in a deal beyond the technical issues to accomplish that. We all know that a nuclear weapons program has three elements. There's fuel fabrication, weaponization, and the delivery vehicle. And let me just go through each one of these things briefly. Fuel fabrication, again, I'm not going to cover in detail the centrifuges and so forth. My colleague has done that well. We need to recognize, though, that the technical compromises we make, however merited they may be or not, will also have strategic implications. They'll send messages to folks in the region, especially if we're moving back from a position that we once held. And we need to make sure that we communicate what we're doing very clearly and that we take into account those strategic implications when we make compromises. We also need to take into account that whatever we permit Iran to keep in terms of nuclear capabilities, others in the region and beyond will have an incentive to match. And so we have to also think about what we allow Iran in terms of the implication for the global nonproliferation regime and our global interests, therefore. When it comes to weaponization research, here I just identify myself with Mr. Toby's comments on making sure that Iran comes clean on what it's done in the past. This will not only facilitate the work of the inspectors by giving them a roadmap to Iran's full nuclear ecosystem, it'll give them a baseline for comparing future Iranian declarations and any intelligence information which we gather about Iran's activities. And it'll also help us to determine exactly how much progress Iran did in fact make on weaponization and whether in fact they've stopped, issues where I don't think that we can say we're 100% certain at this moment. I'd also say that just as a practical matter, we can't really expect much from this agreement going forward if it doesn't begin with transparency. If it begins with obfuscation or dishonesty, I think it starts on the wrong foot. The third element is missiles, Iran's delivery vehicles. This is controversial in a sense because the Iranians have said it can't be included, and P5+1 officials have been ambiguous on the matter. But if you look at Iran's missile capability, Mr. Chairman, you said Iran has the largest missile arsenal in the Middle East. That's right, as far as I know. They are also the first country to develop 2,000-kilometer range missiles without first having a nuclear weapon. We also see that Iran's missiles, because they have poor accuracy, are not suited for conventional payloads. They're part of a nuclear weapons program. Iran is working, as you know, on a space launch program and could have, according to the Defense Department, ICBMs by 2015 at the earliest. So in a sense, this is the leg of Iran's nuclear program which needs the most work. And I think that we need to be sure that Iran doesn't use the time and space provided by an agreement to perfect this last leg of their nuclear program, so that in a couple years they come out having all three legs where they want them and ready for breakout. One more thing on this, addressing missiles and weaponization will also ensure that because there are these competing power centers in Iran, civilian, military, and so forth, that those military power centers, and not just the civilian ones, are bound by any agreement we reach, and that inspectors will have insight into what the military is doing on the nuclear front as well, not just the civilian authorities. One additional consideration for the agreement, I think, has to be the enforcement mechanism. It's one thing to have great inspections and robust inspections and to have strict limits, but what do we do if Iran cheats? We need to decide that up front, and I think that as a condition of U.S. agreement, we need to ensure that the UN Security Council gets behind very vigorous enforcement mechanisms. I think we also need to plan what happens if Iran bends those lines that we set instead of breaking them. If they delay inspections or harass inspectors, we need to know what we'll do in response and what our allies are prepared to do in response as a condition of our agreement. Finally, this issue of regional issues and whether they should be part of an agreement. For me, I think this is a very difficult issue because on the one hand, we're concerned about far more than just Iran's nuclear program, and many of our allies in the region, especially our Arab allies, are more concerned about Iran's regional activities in places like Syria and elsewhere than they are about even Iran's nuclear program. And they don't like the prospect of our relieving pressure before those issues are addressed. At the same time, though, I think that they worry about the optic of our dealing bilaterally with Iran on these regional issues over their heads, and right now don't necessarily trust us to come to the right conclusions on those regional issues. So I think in balance, what we need to see is we need to leave those regional issues out of the nuclear negotiations, but deal with them very firmly separately. Ensure that we leave pressure in place and sanctions in place to put pressure on Iran on those issues, and frankly also improve and make firmer our commitment to the Middle East security in places like Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere as part of the context, the broader context for this agreement. I also worry when it comes to regional issues that, as we saw from the Iranians yesterday, from President Rouhani's chief of staff, that they view the regional issues as leverage to get us to dilute our positions on the nuclear front. Mr. Chairman, let me just end by saying that whether we like it or not, many people, including in the region, see this as the most important issue in the region, with everything else that's going on. And we're going to be judged in terms of our commitment to the Middle East, in terms of our commitment to our own interests, by how this agreement comes out and how firm and strong an agreement it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Pickering.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Smith. It's a pleasure and honor to join you and all the members of the committee, and I thank you very much for the invitation. Since 2013, we've seen a shift in the U.S.-Iran relationship. Official bilateral talks held confidentially, the important election for the president of Iran won by Hassan Rouhani, and the successful completion of the first step of negotiations with the November 24, 2013 Joint Plan of Action have opened the door to progress. Today, this committee wishes to discuss how this progress and a possible comprehensive agreement can impact U.S. strategy in the region beyond. The U.S. strategic objective in the Middle East should be a stable and secure region, open to commerce, to ideas, and to interchange. States in the region should have the opportunity to cooperate, enjoy peaceful relations, and trade among themselves. It should be a region without nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, and I would certainly add without a strong offensive missile capability, particularly at longer ranges. I want to be clear that I strongly oppose Iran acquiring nuclear weapons and am deeply concerned about its support for terrorism and Hezbollah, its violations of human rights of its citizens, and its threats against Israel. I recently led a delegation for the Iran project to Israel and exchanged points of view with the highest levels of the Israeli government, military, and intelligence leadership, as well as respected foreign policy experts. We were well received, and we had engaged discussions of key issues pertaining to Iran and its nuclear program, which lead to a greater understanding of Israeli assessments and outlook on this issue. We plan to continue these informal exchanges. Thanks. The U.S. strategy should be develop policies in support of its long-term goal of a more stable and secure Middle East through peaceful processes, with the use of force reserved only to address the most extreme and unmanageable threats to U.S. security. At the same time, we must recognize that this part of the world is likely to pass through many years, perhaps decades of turmoil, violence, and problems that only the leaders and the people of the region can resolve finally for themselves. What role the U.S. can play and what goals we have laid out are important. An important variable in looking at the strategic outcome is whether the comprehensive nuclear agreement with Iran can be reached and on what time scale. Here, as we assess the strategic implications of that, there are two cases, obviously an agreement or no agreement. Before we assess these two scenarios, however, there are important implications for the U.S. policy in terms of what has already been agreed, and it's instructive to acknowledge that Iran has, in fact, complied with its commitments taken last November in the Joint Program of Action. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which has long been skeptical of Iran's seriousness, has provided monthly reports verifying the scale and timeliness of its actions. And under the Joint Plan of Action, Iran agreed to take several major steps to limit its nuclear capacity. In my testimony, I list these, but the most important is to get out of the 20% enrichment business and to convert that stockpile to something that cannot be rapidly enriched to higher levels. But there also have been a number of other important steps, including capping the number of centrifuges, limiting centrifuge production, capping enrichment at 3 to 5%, keeping the enrichment stockpile at the size and level it was when the agreement went into effect on the 20th of January, and preventing the startup of new centrifuge types and their use in the Iranian program, all of which the IAEA says Iran has been complying with. And for the first time, the expanded safeguards have covered verification, something along the lines that Mr. Toby and Mr. Singh have talked about, and I believe these represent a serious and important start. The consequences for U.S. strategic and defense issues and interests in the Middle East without an agreement are important. We are left there with two really unpalatable options: containing a nuclear-armed Iran or going to war. It is possible that Iran will decide not to pursue a nuclear weapon, and Mr. Smith referred to their attitudes on this up until now, even if an agreement is not reached. But understanding the consequences of alternative strategies to diplomacy is also important. And let me clear about that. There are limits on the use of force in preventing a nuclear-armed Iran. The use of military force by Israel or the United States at best, according to the best experts' estimations, could set the Iran program back only 2 to 4 years. It would not eliminate it. Iran's nuclear capability is, unfortunately, in the minds of its scientists at the moment, which can't be taken out by the use of force alone. In fact, military intervention, short of a decision by Iran to go for a nuclear weapon, might actually stimulate that kind of a decision, and that is important to consider. The failure to reach a diplomatic solution would have profound political implications inside Iran as well. It will certainly weaken the moderates and embolden the hardliners, which would most certainly impact questions of human rights, political openness and freedoms, and all of the other related issues that concern us worldwide. Moreover, if an agreement is not reached, the U.S. and its allies in Western Europe will have no alternative but to fall back on adding more sanctions, which presents in itself new problems. We have learned from the past year that sanctions have worked to get the Iranians to the table to negotiate seriously about issues of great importance to our national security. Yet the imposition now of more sanctions to achieve a better deal will not, in my opinion, having looked at the Iranians for a long period of time, lead to Iranian capitulation on this issue. Preventing Iraq sanctions are not in themselves alone the objective, but are clearly the means to reach a specific goal. In this case, preventing Iraq from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Sanctions work best, if at all, only when the diplomacy around them can work. And an additional sanctions during the diplomatic process could very well upend the entire course of the discussions, losing the transparency that we have gained in the joint program of action and rolling back the important progress we've already made. If the U.S. were to walk away from a deal that most of the other P5+1 partners believe fulfills our main objective, those countries are no longer likely to see value in abiding by the strict sanctions regime that's been set in place under American leadership. This would leave us alone to enforce largely unilateral sanctions, which we know are unfortunately less effective. The consequences of reaching a comprehensive agreement are the opposite. The impact of an agreement that meets U.S. security needs would enhance our security, as well as that of the other nations in the region. It would include a significant reduction in the Iranian program, the institution of the kind of intensive monitoring system that has been recommended by the other witnesses and with which I agree, the prevention of Iran from achieving a nuclear weapons capability. And my testimony assumes that neither the U.S. nor Iran would accept an agreement which was not in their long-term interest. Such an agreement, if it holds, could mark the beginning of a longer process of further efforts, including resolution of many of the problems between the two countries. Early efforts could take many different forms, including confidence-building measures, attempts, as Mr. Singh has outlined, to discuss and agree on regional questions, as well as long-standing questions between the U.S. and Iran stemming back to the fall of the Shah. The process would be long, tenuous, and demanding. No early establishment of full diplomatic relations or normalization of those would be likely. 35 years of mistrust and misunderstanding won't disappear overnight, despite the emergence of areas of mutual interest, such as the possibility for cooperation on Afghanistan and now quite possibly on Iraq. Even if the U.S. were to expand its relations with Iran over coming years, we are unlikely to ever want to accept Iran as a hegemonic force in the region, nor withdraw U.S. military presence from the region. We have simply too much at stake with our friends and allies in the GCC states, in Iraq, and with Israel to shift our strategic focus on the Gulf. Despite recent signs of instability and uncertainty in Syria and Iraq, the U.S. is unlikely to engage in seismic shifts in its policies. Regional strategic implications are harder to read and predict. The sharpening of sectarian conflict between Sunni and Shia, which we're reading about in the papers this morning, has impeded a rapprochement between Arabs and Persians across the Gulf. Yet both sides, at least on the surface, still profess to be committed against war and open for high-level visits, and even seeming agreement, if not full cooperation. Saudi Arabia and its Arab neighbors will need to be satisfied and assured that the U.S. stands with them, even as they seek some regional accord with the parties in the region, including Iran. More importantly, the U.S. support of Israel's security must and will remain the cornerstone of American interests in the region, and U.S. relations with Iran will not change this commitment. Rather than being taxed with building new relations with nations at odds with each other, whether it is Israel or across the Gulf, the U.S. needs to act carefully to achieve better balances on both sides without upsetting its own relationships, and this is a major challenge for our diplomacy. Without a comprehensive agreement, we can expect even more strategic challenges. Could the absence of an agreement encourage Iran to push for nuclear weapons? The answer to this is not clear, but certainly all contingencies have to be considered. The U.S. seeks a reduction in breakout time for Iran in any dash to a nuclear weapon, which is outlined in the comprehensive agreement. Without an agreement, the U.S. and others could still use sanctions, negotiations, and other measures short of force to prevent a potential breakout. Should that fail, in the event Iran were to decide to break out, the implication is clear that the U.S. would keep open its option to use force. My testimony then summarizes those points. It talks about the comprehensive negotiations and where they are. Just a brief set of statements on where I believe those negotiations are today and how we envisage things for the future. Both parties seem committed to finish the current process by July 20th, 2014. The early stages went quite smoothly. Serious differences, however, remain, and they are reported to cover enrichment, the numbers and other characteristics of centrifuges, and the amount of low-enriched uranium which would be allowed to be produced under the deal. The Arak reactor and plutonium output, possible military dimensions concerns now being handled by the IAEA, which also my colleagues here at the table focused upon, the extent of inspection, which I believe is extremely important, sanctions relief, and the duration of an agreement. There are possible paths through each of these issues, and an agreement will have to require very tough compromises. Iran is focused on creating a peaceful civil program, it says, protecting what it has already achieved, in part to address domestic political opposition in Iran, which remains strong. The U.S. seeks a minimal Iran civilian program capable of meeting its current needs without significant increases in breakout time. The scope of subjects to be resolved is reportedly agreed, and some progress has already been made on a number of these issues. My humble opinion is that it will be a real stretch and a hard push to get all of this in place by the 20th of July, much as it represents important advantages for the parties on both sides. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Toby, Mr. Singh, in your testimony you described what should be included in any comprehensive deal with Iran. As I said in my statement, I'm pessimistic that the administration will push the P5+1 to sufficiently address in a comprehensive deal Iran's state sponsorship of terrorism, its ballistic missile program, any covert activities, and the conventional military programs that support the military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program. If the administration does not address these facets that support Iran's nuclear program and its ability to project power, what would be the implications for security in the region and beyond?
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I could just start on that. I think that if we do not address, especially the other elements of Iran's nuclear weapons program, its nuclear weapons capabilities besides fuel fabrication, and let me be clear, I think it's very important that we extend Iran's breakout time as much as possible. I don't think it was wise to abandon our position arguing for no enrichment in Iran and no plutonium activities in Iran. But we're well beyond that point now, obviously. If we don't, however, address those other two legs of the nuclear stool, as it were, then we really haven't fully addressed even the nuclear weapons program. And I think that we will leave Iran in a position where it can continue to work towards a nuclear weapons capability and perfect a nuclear weapons capability, even if it's paused certain elements of its fuel fabrication program. We also, I think, put at greater risk the chance that Iran could covertly develop a nuclear weapon, because it would be openly and licitly, permissibly working on those other elements of a program, which means it would only covertly have to address the fuel fabrication side of things. I think also for our image in the region, our prestige in the region, an agreement which is very minimalist will result in some, as I mentioned in my testimony, negative reverberations within the region, because people will see it, in a sense, as a triumph for Iran and as a sign, again, that the United States has a weakening commitment to the region.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a remark or two on your question, which I think is extremely important? Since the beginning of the negotiating effort, beginning with the Bush administration and now the Obama administration, there's been a very strong reluctance to add to the nuclear negotiations other issues, however important they are. And that reluctance was based in, I think, a well-founded concern which Mr. Singh mentioned in his discussion related to his testimony. And that was that the more things we add to the present deal, the more likely it is we're going to have to pay in the coin, if I could put it this way, of nuclear concessions to get the kind of additional objectives we want. And that it is very clear, as Mr. Singh said, that a missile without a nuclear capability is much less dangerous than one with. And therefore, focusing our time and attention and putting every effort behind putting the nuclear business in a situation where we believe we have now high confidence that they will not develop a nuclear weapon, which is the objective of the comprehensive agreement, in my view, is probably worth the priority we have assigned to it, rather than attempt to create a kind of grand bargain, including both the missiles and the nuclear weapons issue at the same time. I've thought a great deal about this because seemingly on the surface dealing with missiles is persuasive, but missiles without a warhead puts us in a lot stronger position to deal with missiles as a second issue, and I would certainly recommend very strongly that missiles not be left behind. But I think it's important to consider the thinking of both administrations in this.
Mr. Chairman, my fellow panelists have dealt with other aspects of your question. I'd like to focus on the covert problem, as I did really in my testimony. I think a failure to deal with the covert issue and focusing on, there are really three ways in which Iran could attain a nuclear weapon. They could break out of the treaty using declared facilities. They could sneak out of the treaty using undeclared facilities, or they could buy a weapon or materials from some other state. Those are the theoretical possibilities. A lot of the focus of the negotiations has been on the overt facilities, putting in place a fire break that would make it a longer period during which they would need to break out of the treaty. I'm concerned that the most likely path that Iran would take would be use of covert facilities, and that's why I recommend the 3 elements of a deal that I did.
I might be very naive, but it seems to me if they were just wanting to have nuclear capability to provide energy for their nation, they wouldn't have to have their facility under a mountain. It could be open. They could have inspectors. I mean, it could be totally transparent. And it just seems to me that it's so obvious what their real goal is that that anything else that we think about is just kind of superfluous to the situation. I just think we just play right into their hands. The longer we talk, the more they're able to do. And that just seems that we just play right into their hands on this whole subject. Is Mr. Smith gone? Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the fact that we are holding this hearing today. As you know, the 18 years I've been here in the Congress, I think I have been on the subcommittee that deals with this for 16 of those 18 years. So I'm incredibly interested in this topic, and I think that there's real doubt by many of us here that there's going to be a deal by July 20th on the P5+1. And I think when we hear the chairman and his understanding of the situation, our understanding the negotiations that are going on with respect to number of centrifuges and giving that up, the ARAC heavy water reactor, all of these issues, I think, give us an inability to trust that even if we made a deal, that the deal would be followed through. When I look back, I look at the fact that Iran has defied 6 UN Security Council resolutions that have called for it to suspend uranium enrichment and reprocessing activities, and that it has consistently pursued, I believe, a very covert action of enrichment in its capabilities. And it's, of course, very evident that it's ignored or not allowed IAEA inspectors full access to nuclear-related sites. So my questions, I have several. First would be, how can the P5+1 more effectively pursue better monitoring and verification processes during these ongoing negotiations? That would be my first question. And how can we ensure that the IAEA inspectors can have better access to Iran's facilities? Because a lot of this negotiation deals with ability to verify and actually go in and seek out these issues. So that would be my first set of questions to whomever. Yes, Doctor.
Perhaps I could begin. I think that your point is very important, and indeed, full inspection and monitoring is a critical question in dealing with a lot of potential issues. The Joint Plan of Action itself has unprecedented new monitoring arrangements in the current 6-month period for the International Atomic Energy Agency, including for the first time ever inspection of centrifuge parts production and centrifuge assembly plants, including daily access to Iran's nuclear facilities, something that has been, I think, speeded up and is unusual. and including, instead of providing the world with quarterly reports of what's happening in Iran, the IAEA is now providing monthly reports on Iranian compliance with all of the aspects of the Joint Plan of Action. The IAEA is clearly, in my view, at an absolute minimum, going to have to apply something called the additional protocol, something the Iranians agreed to for a period of 2 years. They signed but did not ratify. And at the end of the 2-year period, because of their objections to continued Western insistence that they go to 0 centrifuges and 0 enrichment, they resumed a regular inspection cycle rather than the additional protocol. The additional protocol provides a great deal more access, including at the choice of the IAEA rather than the basis of prior agreement. I myself have believed for a long period of time we also ought to draw lessons from the Iraq inspections that were under a separate negotiated arrangement with Iraq stemming out of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 and indeed the period after that and a series of UN resolutions. That, at a minimum, in my view, should give the IAEA anytime, anywhere access, which was the standard in Iraq. And it turned out, in fact, that that standard was a lot better, despite the fact that the Iraqis had on occasion tried to resist those inspections. Nevertheless, it was the mobilization, put it this way, of international strength and support, our military presence in the area, the no-fly zone, and indeed other capabilities, which in the end I think helped a great deal to get the kind of level of assurance that we had. Those kinds of approaches are important. Finally, since Iraq, and indeed since the additional protocol, new technical techniques for examining and following the kinds of activities that should constitute part of the inspection mechanism should themselves be incorporated in any new ramified inspection arrangement with regard to Iran. That obviously has to be based on access, but with the access of the additional protocol and what I would suggest beyond that, I think we have gotten close to the kind of inspection that can give us not absolute certainty, but at least a high confidence that our system can not only monitor what's already going on, but have a reasonable chance of finding covert activities. The reasonable news is that up until now, when Iran started hidden activities, we had a very good indication through our national intelligence mechanism several years ahead of the actual declaration of those facilities, about which the Iranians disputed with the UN, but nevertheless we knew. I think finally we have a huge envelope of ambiguity against the Iranians in attempting covert activity, particularly if we make our capacity to respond to that, up to and including the use of force if necessary, is clear and on the table as a part of the agreement. The ambiguity being that the uncertainty on their side and the consequences of failing to comply with the agreement become a great deal more punishing than the uncertainty on our side, and that's helpful in deterring the Iranians from moving in that direction. But I would be the first to say we will never achieve 100%. We can achieve very high confidence, as you know. On a regular basis, General Clapper is able to tell us in his annual report that the Iranians have not made a decision to make a nuclear weapon, and he continues to say this with what he calls high confidence, which, as I read the intelligence in this particular issue and the judgments about intelligence, is a pretty solid basis for making that kind of conclusion.
Mr. Chairman, I would just like to put on the record that if we're to continue down this particular path of this negotiation, this anytime, anywhere issue, for me is really a make or break, because you know, the problem is not what they're going to let us take a look at. The problem is what they don't show us and what they have, and that's where all of these issues have occurred. And thank you for your indulgence on the time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I join with you that I'm very concerned about superfluous, to me, almost wishful thinking as world peace is at risk with the potential of Iran developing a nuclear capability. And I appreciate, too, that the concerns we have really are bipartisan. There is just such a concern. We need to, I think, refresh our memories, and that is that in considering these negotiations with Iran, a state sponsor of terrorism, I believe that the President is putting American families at risk by ignoring the clear threats of Iran's rulers. In fact, I believe that weakness will lead to conflict and more attacks worldwide. In 1983, we should not forget, but somehow people have, that the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut was by Iran. It was the largest explosive device since Hiroshima. 305 personnel were killed. We should remember that, of course, it was Iran that produced the IEDs to kill American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, killing civilians, too. And it's horrific that these IEDs were used, vehicle-borne, to purposely kill Iraqi children. This was not an accident. The President's failed to encourage the Green Revolution, where the young people of Iran wanted change, regime change. The people seeking regime change actually were shot and killed in the streets and were not given the encouragement they should. And we know Iran is the culture of ancient Persia, and there's a great history that should be reestablished, but not through an authoritarian regime. And just this spring, we know that Iran was transshipping missiles to terrorists. But fortunately, Iran has seized Israel has stopped this transfer. The message that we should understand at rallies in Tehran, the signs that are carried are in English for our benefit, and they're very clear. They say death to America, death to Israel. That's what they mean. In light of that, Mr. Singh, as Iran refuses to reveal the extent of its nuclear program now, while talks are ongoing, what would make anyone believe that they would reveal the extent of these programs accurately once a comprehensive agreement is reached? In your view, should the P5+1 sign a comprehensive deal with Iran if Iran has not fully satisfied all the IAEA concerns regarding possible military dimensions?
Thank you, Congressman. I think it's an excellent question. I think the answer is no, that this has to be a key element of what we do. Right now, this is being pursued by the IAEA, this question of possible military dimensions, and let's face it, that word possible is a bit generous. These are military dimensions to a program. That's what the weaponization research is for. And these clearly need to be resolved, and we need to see Iran come clean. Because it's important, I think, that this start from, as Mr. Toby said, a clear strategic decision by Iran to leave the military elements of its program behind. And unless they're willing to do that, then I don't think that we should sign an agreement. I think it's also very important for the inspectors. The Congresswoman's question about how do we strengthen inspections, I think that having these issues resolved, having Iran come clean on its past activities, is absolutely key to that. So the inspectors have a roadmap, have a baseline. But there's other elements to that, Congressman. I think that we need to make sure that we keep our own intelligence resources in place, that we don't start drawing them down because we think this issue is finished after an agreement is signed. We have to keep our eye on Iran. I think it's important that we keep military forces in the region, that we don't draw those down thinking that this problem is solved after an agreement is signed, because, again, we need a credible enforcement mechanism and a credible military threat, if necessary, which hopefully we'll never have to use. So I do think that that's an incredibly important part of the program. Look, I think that what we really want to see is a strategic decision by Iran to forgo any hope of having nuclear weapons in the future. We'd like to see a broader shift by Iran, such that we could have a better relationship with them. But I don't see yet evidence of that shift, nor am I necessarily confident that if we sign a nuclear agreement, you'll start to see those kind of broader easing of tensions. We could hope for that, but I think we need to be clear-eyed, we need to be realistic, and we're going to need to continue to push back, I would say, far harder than we are now on Iranian shipment of arms, Iranian support for terrorism, and other activities like that, in part to show our allies that we're not stepping back from the region in the wake of an agreement.
And I appreciate that very much, and I share your concern. And, hey, the thought that we would be considering military dimensions, as we know they're developing a ballistic missile capability that could attack southeastern Europe all the way back over to India. So our allies are at risk. Thank you.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Wilson, could I just make a comment on Mr. Singh has had to say?
Gentleman's time has expired, so we need to move on. Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of you. It seems to me that we're looking at a number of continuums here. I mean, from what I guess we might see as ideal to absolutely horrible, in addition to the time factors that we're looking at. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and where time itself fits into this, whether and who it's serving. The sanctions seem to have had an impact in terms of bringing Iran to the table, but how much longer and how more aggressive if we were to move in that direction in a different way? And where do you see that? I mean, is there a breaking point here in some ways in terms of Iran and the impact of those sanctions, and certainly the public reaction as well? Some people have talked about face-saving measures, things that are needed. Could you help out with that?
Perhaps I could take a shot at that. I think that up until November, it was, I think, quite clear to all of us as Iran made larger amounts of 20% material and increased the number of centrifuges it had in operation on a regular basis, that time was not on our side. At least momentarily, through the 20th of July, the Joint Plan of Action gets rid of the 20% material, keeps the level of low-enriched uranium stockpile the way it was at the beginning, allows the introduction of no more centrifuges, and indeed does a great number of things, not everything, but does a great number of things that I think are helpful. Various estimates have been made of the amount of breakout time that particular agreement allows us, perhaps gone from as low as 2 weeks to something on the order of 2 or 3 months. These are just estimates. I don't know that anybody can prove this on a stack of Bibles, but I think it's a more comfortable position. It also set a standard for the comprehensive agreement. The comprehensive agreement must be based on our agreement about an ongoing Iranian civil nuclear program as the basis. It says joint agreement, but that means our agreement has to be there. That's an extremely important standard that has to be met. If time does not allow us until the 20th of July, we have another opportunity because the Joint Plan of Action allows another 6 months.
Includes another step, right?
And includes that.
Phase.
Presumably, but I don't know, it would have to be decided whether, in fact, all of those limitations will apply. Will there be any more sanctions relief or no more sanctions relief? My own view would be the status quo as it exists now should be extended for additional negotiations if it looks like we have made real progress. If we don't, then we have to face the hard decision as to whether we walk away from the table. And the consequences of that I've laid out in my testimony. I think it's very important. I'd like just to add one more point. Mr. Singh seems to put a lot of faith. He and I don't agree on a lot of things, but I agree on most of what he and Mr. Toby have said here today, particularly on inspection. But Mr. Singh seems to put a lot of faith in the notion that the Iranians would somehow tell us that they have been involved in a weapons program and they now no longer are. And I would not. The history with Iran and perhaps with North Korea, I would put a lot of faith in the ideas that they and I have put forward, that it's through inspection and intelligence collection and the best job we can do in squeezing that program down that will give us the faith that they aren't going to go. And even if they say, in fact, well, we made these steps and we're not serious and we're not going to do it again, thank you very much, I would not at that point be convinced. I would want very much to see an ongoing program of monitored, verified action on their part.
Yeah, and I guess there's an expectation there. I would think that they anticipate also that is part of the deal. We're going to go past July 20th, likely.
I think so. And to be clear, I would say that both are necessary, not just one or the other. I think we have to have an accounting of past work as well as ongoing, very intrusive inspections, where I agree with Ambassador Pickering, for whom I have great respect, that we need to have Iraq-style on-demand inspections. I have a hard time believing that the current differences that we have between the United States side and our P5+1 partners and Iran on the issues of centrifuges, sanctions relief, the timeline of an agreement, can be bridged before July 20th, but especially the centrifuge issue, because there we're very far apart. And it's hard, in a sense, to understand the Iranian position, because Iran, if it really just wants nuclear power, remember, most states in the world that have nuclear power import their nuclear fuel. We here in the United States import a good portion of our nuclear fuel. Iran itself, for its one working nuclear reactor, imports its nuclear fuel. And so it's hard to make sense of that position absent a desire for nuclear weapons.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Franks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I guess the first thing I should do is to ask for diplomatic immunity here today, because I've heard some things that leave me bewildered or even astonished. I've heard statements that the goal of Iran is to gain nuclear weapons without international condemnation. And I think if Iran could gain nuclear weapons with or without international condemnation, if that was the only thing that they had to worry about, they would proceed tomorrow. I've heard it said that there's evidence that they don't intend to do it because they've chosen not to build, when every piece of evidence we have says that they have been pursuing this for a long time. I've heard it said, you know, that we need to just cap the enrichment to 3 to 5%, when most people who are familiar with that process knows that from the time we find uranium in the ground to the time that we can take it to 4.5%, we're 80% or more the way there to a fissile material, to a weapons-grade material. I've heard it said that we could only possibly set them back 2 to 4 years, that somehow we would suggest that the United States of America could not prevent Iran from gaining nuclear weapons if the commitment was there. And I find that just, again, hard to express here. I've heard it said that there's conclusions that there's a high confidence that they have not made the decision to pursue a nuclear weapons capability. And I would suggest to you that that involves having to have clairvoyance. And especially in the face of any available evidence points exactly to the opposite. Mr. Chairman, I believe that this administration is placing us all on a trajectory where Iran gains a nuclear weapons capability and sets the entire world walking in the shadow of nuclear terrorism. And I find it just astonishing that there's such a casual cognitive dissonance here, that somehow that we don't seem to understand how significant the issue really is. To see the world's leading sponsor of terrorism gaining a nuclear weapons capability will cause us to need a new calendar. It will change everything. Our children will never walk in peace again if that happens. The American people understand that, and I'm astonished that some of the most erudite leaders in this country don't seem to grasp that. Mr. Chairman, under the interim agreement, Iran is essentially protected in a protocol for enrichment up to 3 to 5%. And Mr. Chairman, I would suggest to you, sir, that that is the whole ballgame. That if Iran can enrich uranium or produce plutonium, that it is within their power to proceed to a nuclear weapons capability at will. The breakout is just a matter of a few months at the most. And Mr. Chairman, I guess I need to calm down here a little bit and just ask one basic question. You know, we have seen the United Nations Security Council adopt multiple resolutions since 2006 demanding Iran's full and sustained suspension of all uranium enrichment related and reprocessing activities, and Iran's full cooperation with the IAEA on all outstanding issues related to its nuclear activities. And to date, Iran has violated almost all of those resolutions. Now, if Iran's nuclear aspirations are only for peaceful purposes, why would they continually violate these resolutions and hide their nuclear facilities, as Mr. Chairman, you said, under a mountain? Very appropriate question in my mind, for decades in these secretive compounds. So my question, I'm going to send it to Mr. Singh if I could, and incidentally, sir, I think your analysis has been excellent here today. The interim agreement did not fulfill the demands of United Nations Security Council resolutions, and the question is, do you have confidence that any final deal will satisfy those resolutions?
Well, thank you, Mr. Congressman. It does not look like a final deal will satisfy those requirements. What the resolution said was that, and these were often unanimous resolutions, said that Iran had to suspend its enrichment, reprocessing, and heavy water-related work. Right now, the heavy water reactor at Arak is continuing, although they've suspended some elements of that under the interim agreement. But it looks like as part of a final deal, they'll be permitted to continue with that work. Yeah. Enrichment, we've conceded also on enrichment, as you indicated, and so, no, I can't say that a final agreement.
So Mr. Chairman, ultimately, the centrifuges are going to continue to spin, and this administration is going to continue to fiddle. I yield back.
Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, gentlemen. Thanks for being here. First question really goes to transparency in this process, and I'm wondering, Ambassador, is it possible or realistic, and if so, how, to create an environment where the IAEA has full access to the entirety of the Iranian nuclear program, to include the military sites, and if they're refusing to reveal the extent of their research and development now, what would give us any assurance or confidence that once an agreement is reached that we would have access both to the sites and to the extent of their R&D? And how can we reach an agreement unless we have this?
The purpose of the present agreement is to satisfy your second point. That is that the IAEA will be satisfied that all of the actions taken by Iran under the rubric of possible military developments, that is, actions they took between 1998 and 2003, which we have good reason to suspect were involved in the militarization of their nuclear program, have to be explained and revealed, if I can put it that way, for the reasons that Mr. Singh made clear, and with which I agree, that we can't inspect future programs if we don't know how they misbehaved in the past. And so that's very important. That work is apparently going ahead. Will it be done by the 20th of July? I very much doubt it. And that will be an important factor in the consideration. But I don't think we should have a comprehensive deal until we are satisfied on that point. With respect to the first question, is it possible for us to put into place a regime under which we could expect any time, anywhere? And the answer to that is yes. The difficulty is it possible to put into a place where we know exactly what's going on in the head of the Iranian leadership at any particular time and in any particular moment? At the moment, we have not yet, with all respect, solved that problem. That is a traditional problem of intelligence, where, in fact, we can know a great deal. We may know a lot. Congressman Franks was rather disparaging of General Clapper a moment ago, the Director of National Intelligence, who continues to say year after year he believes with high confidence. And if Mr. Franks doesn't really know, he should ask General Clapper, because it's important that he understand why General Clapper agrees with high confidence that Iran has not made a decision to go for a nuclear weapon. But the principal problem is going anywhere and looking at everything gives us a leg up, but it doesn't give us total, absolute, 100%, vacuum-proof confidence.
Thank you.
That we can do it.
Thank you. And the second question for Mr. Toby, with your involvement and experience with North Korea, I'm wondering what lessons learned should we be cognizant of now to make sure that this deal does not end up with the situation where we are today, where we continue to deal with a nuclear threat from North Korea?
There's a very direct lesson. At the time of the agreed framework, there was a dispute between the IAEA and North Korea about whether or not they would have access to certain of the material in North Korea that would give them definitive knowledge of what North Korea had done in the past. The United States actually undermined the IAEA by saying it wasn't worth blocking a deal to go back and understand what had happened before. And unfortunately, that I think it was done in good faith and with some reasonably credible view that in a time when communist regimes were falling all over the world, the North Korea problem would solve itself within 5 years, and it wasn't worth risking no deal to understand history. My point about understanding the possible military dimensions in Iran is that it is worth and it is necessary to have a good deal. And one thing I would clarify with respect to the possible military dimensions, the point's been made that they halted in 2003. Actually, what the IAEA has reported is that there are indications that some activities relevant to the development of a nuclear explosive device continued after 2003, and that some may still be ongoing. So this isn't all about history. This is about the future.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last month, I offered an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, which stated that the United States should only agree to a comprehensive agreement with Iran if 3 conditions are met. 1, Iran must cease enriching uranium. 2, Iran must cease pursuing or developing nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons and ballistic missile technology. And 3, Iran must stop supporting terrorism. These are positions taken by the House in the past. This language was adopted by this committee, and the bill passed unanimously out of this committee and passed the House by a strong bipartisan vote. So let the record reflect that this now is the position of the U.S. House of Representatives. For Mr. Toby or Mr. Singh, can you describe the difference between the Israel and the U.S. definitions of what the red line is that should not be crossed, must not be crossed by Iran?
Well, I'm actually a little unclear as to what, if any, red lines the United States has drawn with respect to Iran. I think it was pretty clear from Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech at the United Nations, where he had the graphic, that production of 20% enriched uranium beyond a certain level was unacceptable to Israel. So I guess that would describe the difference as I understand it.
And Mr. Singh, how would you answer that?
I think that Mr. Toby is right. I think that the Israelis, but also not just the Israelis. I mean, the Israelis are very vocal on these points, but I think their basic view is shared by quite a few of our allies in the region, that some of the concessions that we have already made in the negotiations go too far for their comfort level. And so there's a lot of nervousness about what we're prepared to concede in this agreement, what we've already conceded in the negotiations, and what sort of stance we'll have after an agreement is reached, if in fact an agreement is reached. And so I would say that there are significant gaps between the U.S. and our allies, both Israel and the Arab allies, and it's very important that as part of our Iran policy, broadly, we address these differences, that we address these concerns that our allies have, lest we find ourselves again in a strategically much worse position after an agreement is signed.
Well, when I look at, my personal opinion is when we look at those differences, I'm inclined to agree with them more than the administration's position on which is the better approach. Changing subjects here, Secretary Kerry indicated that we are open to cooperate with Iran on the ISIS crisis in Iraq. Do you think that if such cooperation with Iran were to take place, that would give them license to be more aggressive in the region, thus impacting the nuclear negotiations? Mr. Toby?
Well, I think actually what some Iranian officials already have said is that the crisis in Iraq should give them greater leverage on the nuclear matter. In other words, if the United States expects Iranian help in Iraq, the United States should show greater flexibility in the nuclear talks. I think, of course, that were we to pursue such flexibility, it would be a disaster.
Another question, changing subjects. There's been some discussion in the Senate, and it's been squelched, but I know Senators Menendez and from Illinois, Kirk, want to have pass a bill, have sanctions in place in case the negotiations break through, do not go forward, as an incentive to the Iranians to keep negotiating. Would you, either of you two, agree with that being a good bill to pass at this time?
I think the notion of contingent sanctions being real to the Iranian government is a constructive one for a good outcome.
I would just add to that. Look, I think in any negotiation like this, there has to be an or else that's out there for the Iranians. And I think that or else can take multiple forms: a credible military threat, which I think right now isn't very credible, or contingent sanctions.
Yeah, and I agree with both of you. I'm glad to hear you say that. And Mr. Pickering, my last question, if Iran were to somehow develop a nuclear weapon, what would be, can you list some of the other countries in the region that would want to have their own nuclear program and or weapon, just so the public can be aware?
Well, I can. I think that we have always been concerned that countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt less so because of the turmoil in Egypt at the present time, although Egypt is still a formidable potential power for moving in this direction. And in the past, we saw indications over the last 3 or 4 decades of Egyptian interest in this direction.
Any others?
I think the United Arab Emirates, although we have a very tight 123 agreement with them that rules out enrichment and reprocessing, and so that's important. Could I just mention on contingency sanctions, my sense is we have contingency sanctions in place at the present time, that the Iranians believe, in fact, that sanctions will happen immediately when the President wants it. Thank you.
Thank you. We need to stay within the timelines or we won't be able to get all the questions in. Ms. Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, it's good to see you. I want to return to the inspection regime. And, you know, what we're talking with Iran right now is that all the things we're asking them to do are all reversible, right? Not enriching uranium beyond the 20% and the like. But going back to the inspection regime, how confident are you, given U.S. intelligence and IAEA's verification capabilities, that a 6-month breakout window would be a sufficient period of time for us to actually even detect and counter them doing so? I mean, do we have the intelligence capabilities right now to even detect? I'm afraid that they're going to be further down in that 6-month window, and we won't even detect it, and we won't be able to react in time.
I think it's a very good question. My own sense is that there are some people who would like to have the breakout window as long as 5 years. There are some who might agree on 3 years. The U.S. government is purported to have said 6 months to 12 months, maybe more if they could get it, would be very useful. I think breakout is just one measure. The important questions that my 2 colleagues and I have put before you on inspection and monitoring are really a key. In effect, if you don't know what's going on, no amount of breakout time is of any value. Right. And so we have to look at this as a whole nexus of factors and elements that we have to take into account. And so it's very important. I think that breakout time, as my testimony makes clear, is designed to provide us an opportunity before using force, which the President has kept on the table and says is on the table, to see if we can stop a breakout short of the use of force. But the use of force is not taken off the table by an extension of breakout time. It shouldn't be, in my view. It is still there. A use of force might stop a breakout. It might not stop a breakout, but it appears to be one of the better factors that we have going for us in that particular set of issues. I'm not sure if I've addressed your question well, but I think that it's that combination of doing our best to know what's going on. I think our intelligence has been pretty good, but anybody who believes their intelligence is perfect is in trouble.
Well, thank you. I want to follow up on that, you know, and sort of go back to what you said earlier about the need for inspections, and that we can't come from a position where we trust that the Iranians will tell us that they're doing things in secret. You know, if an agreement is reached which involves sanctions relief, I mean, how do we assure that the relief is not abused to advance a secret program beyond the inspection regime? And also, are there additional steps that the U.S. needs to take to combat their illicit procurement activities? And I'm thinking specifically, they're going to have, if we reduce some of these sanctions, greater access to other markets. They're going to have more participation with other potential providers. They're not going to tell us, hey, we're secretly buying this stuff on the side because we now have access. What other things can we do beyond the inspection regime to ensure that we safeguard?
Well, I think we have heavily relied on our intelligence in the past to look at procurement activities. The IAEA does not have an intelligence system. It relies, in effect, on tip-offs from the intelligence systems of the big powers and other countries that have good intelligence. And in the past, intelligence has sometimes erred. But it, in my view, is better to make a mistake and go look at it than it is to make the mistake of not taking into account what you think you're seeing and not look at it. And that's very, very important. I do agree that as we have gotten down into procurement, particularly into centrifuge construction and the making of the rotors for the centrifuges, which are a very important element, and some of the specific materials that are not available to the Iranians or the Iranians have trouble making and are heavily dependent on the import, it's significant. It's very significant to look at that kind of material and take a look at whether, in fact, there may be covert operations using that material, because the material balance between what we know and the material balance between what they import will show differences which will give us that kind of telltale. So there are useful ways of looking at these particular problems that can give us confidence, even high confidence. I keep telling you, however, I think there is nothing perfect, but I would rather go with a deal with all of the monitoring and access that we have been talking about here at this table, and on which I think we have an agreement, than not go with a deal and have no monitoring and access at all.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Nugent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, the testimony we heard today ranges across the board from being very optimistic to being pessimistic, talking about inspections. Do we truly believe that the IAEA is going to have the power to do the inspections necessary? Because I do believe that we need to be more than just hopeful that we're getting the right information, and we hear that, well, we're never going to be certain. Well, I'd rather err on the side of certainty, over-inspect than under-inspect. Do we have any confidence that we can have that occur on inspections?
The IAEA has very important, significant verification capabilities, great technical expertise. But ultimately, their power to sort of use those authorities is a political one. It depends on the Board of Governors in the first instance, and after that, the United Nations Security Council. So if it comes to a point in which there is a dispute as to what they should be looking at and what they shouldn't, it will be resolved politically in the Security Council.
If I could just say, Congressman, that I think this may sound obvious, but the bigger the program you leave Iran with, the harder those inspections are. And so I would encourage us not to see the size of the program and the rigor of the inspections as somehow a trade-off, that, well, if you've got good inspections, you can give them a lot more residual capacity. I think you'd want to help the inspectors by ensuring that program is as constrained as possible and that it has that political backing via a very strong enforcement mechanism to which we have a credible commitment.
And Mr. Nugent, I think it's extremely important that we get a Security Council resolution supporting the agreement, and hopefully one that says that if it is necessary to use force, sanctions, and pressure, we have the right to do so.
Well, I appreciate that succinct answer. There was a comment made about their covert activities, and I guess that really is the crux of it. You've heard the chairman talk about, well, if you're doing this for peaceful means, why would you have the facility under a mountain? Well, you wouldn't. I mean, you just wouldn't. But what are the chances, I guess, and this is the hard question, because intelligence is great, but we know that the intelligence community has missed the mark on so many issues. But once you miss it, it's almost impossible to go back and correct the issue. Talk about covert opportunities that they have, or even the opportunities to purchase a weapon.
verification is the process of presenting a complete picture of the entire fabric of activities. And if there are inconsistencies, loose threads, pulling at those loose threads until you understand exactly what happened. And if you actually have access to people and documents and places, it becomes very difficult to hide those things, especially when the inspection process interacts with intelligence means.
But do we have that today?
It is not in place today. It's my hope that any agreement would have that as a key component.
Congressman, if I could just add, you asked what confidence do we have? A former Deputy Director General of the IAEA, Ali Heinen, has pointed out that if Iran doesn't have a covert element to its program now, it would be the first time in decades that they don't have that. Remember that all these facilities we're talking about, Arak, Natanz, Fordo, were once clandestine facilities, which were exposed, which were not declared by Iran but exposed. And they're all still in place and all still functioning.
And lastly, we talked about ballistic missiles. Why would we have a ballistic missile or in development of ballistic missile for conventional versus the need, obviously, to have a delivery vehicle if you're going to go down the weaponization of a nuclear? Why would we have, or why would you be spending time and money on development of ballistic missiles if your intention was just to use it as a conventional delivery system?
It makes no military sense. There could be some argument that it could be useful as a terror weapon, not particularly appealing either.
I would just have to add that, of course, Iran and Iraq fought an 8-year war. They all had ballistic missiles at that time. They had no nuclear weapons. We were worried about nuclear weapons, but the nuclear weapon program came along in Iran after that war.
And I guess, and the last thing is, I just have a hard time trusting Iran, just from the mere fact when I was in Iraq in 2011, Iranian warhead was used to kill 5 of our soldiers. And they didn't get that off the shelf at Walmart. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nugent. Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you for being here today and for your testimony. As a co-sponsor of H.R. 850, the Nuclear Iran Prevention Act, I'm very concerned, as many of my colleagues are, about the nuclear Iran and what that would mean for our ally in Israel. I was in Israel last August, and I saw firsthand the threats on every border. But every official I met with, whether they were military or political, from all across the spectrum, said one thing consistently, and that is, we have to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And I agree with that. We cannot be talking about containment. We have to talk about prevention. And I understand the importance of attempting a diplomatic solution, and I hope that there's some success here, but I remain skeptical about Iran and how trustworthy they could be on any agreement. In fact, when I was meeting, along with other members, with representatives from the administration, we asked them, have you identified, has intelligence identified all of the Iranian nuclear facilities? And said, no, we haven't, because some are hard to find. And entering into negotiations or an agreement on that basis is very worrisome to me, and I think we need to be very careful about it. So I'd like you, if you could, to comment on that issue of whether or not we can, in fact, reach an agreement that would identify the facilities so they can be inspected. Secondly, I'm concerned about the removal of sanctions. I think it was going to be extraordinarily difficult to rebuild sanctions if an agreement does not get concluded. And I'd like you to, if you could, to comment on that. And then finally, I want to go to the issue that was raised earlier by my colleague about the recent advice we've been getting across the board that we should perhaps have some discussions with Iran about joining together to secure Iraq from ISIS. It seems to me that this is a peculiar step for us to take with Iran, given our position on Syria and historically on Iran. So I'd like you to respond a little bit more in detail, if you could, to how the negotiations, if they occur with Iran and ISIS in Iraq, how will they affect in any specific way the P5+1 negotiations? And conversely, can the P5+1 negotiations further complicate and potentially worsen an already delicate situation with Iraq? and how would these negotiations potentially affect our relationship with Israel? I know I've given you a lot, but I wanted to get all the questions in so we could conserve on time, and perhaps you can respond as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Perhaps I could take a shot at a couple of the points that you make. I think that Iran has said they want to use the Iraq issue to see if they can affect the nuclear negotiations. The U.S. has said very clearly it's not going to do that. And I think that that's important. I don't see the president at the moment rushing into Iraq again. I think, if anything, he's consulting up here and being very cautious about it, but we can all have our own ideas about that particular issue. I think on the question of inspections, you've gotten us into Don Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns. Of course, by definition, unknowns are not knowable, and there's no way to get around that. What we do, I think, see is that Iran's nuclear capacities are understood and known. We know where the pieces are, and I don't believe there are pieces that we don't know about in terms of the chain of facilities required to do enrichment, the chain of facilities required to produce heavy water. They have no capacity to produce plutonium in a reprocessing plant at the present time. So we see most of that. The really interesting question is, could there be an entirely black covert program going on? And Olli Heinonen, whose views I respect, may not have been referring to anything that large. He may have been referring to individual experiments about pieces of activity that we saw back before 2003. We don't know. But it is important to believe, at least, that we have a pretty good chance, and I think there's agreement here at the table, of finding bigger pieces that would be important in producing the nuclear fuel or conforming and configuring the warhead that we're worried about. And there I have some confidence that we're in better shape.
Thank you. I know we have very little time. Quickly, Mr. Toby, Mr. Singh.
Let me just say on sanctions relief that I think we should, if there is an agreement, sanctions relief should be backloaded. That anything that's irreversible, and I agree that sanctions would be very hard to put back together, should come at the end of the process once we've seen what Iran's track record is. And even then, I think there's a number of sanctions that are going to have to stay in place because they address issues like terrorism.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. Like many of my colleagues, I'm a skeptic about the reality of what these talks can produce for us. But I'm even further concerned by some of the testimony we've already heard about what might be the threat to the talks by introducing as a sidebar issue this issue of the potential of some help or some cooperation between the United States and Iran in the Iraq ISIL issue. Now, I heard, Mr. Toby, you made some pretty strong comments about that. From my experience in negotiating, if I introduce a new issue in negotiations, the person with whom I'm negotiating is going to want something back in return for that. Are we, in fact, endangering our position in the negotiations over this agreement by introducing, even as a sidebar issue, this whole issue of some communication or cooperation between the United States and Iran with regard to the ISIL issue in Iraq?
I think, sir, that Iran will be moved to do what they think they need to do to save Prime Minister Maliki and his regime. In my view, that fundamentally means changing Mr. Maliki's view on how he deals with the minorities in his own countries. The ISIS people have scooped up lots of people who have been antagonized by Mr. Maliki among the Sunni population. And you remember back when we moved into Anbar and changed our policies and worked with the Sunnis. He's done exactly the opposite. He hasn't helped them. He hasn't supported them. He's put them in jail. He's treated them very badly. ISIS has made a lot of progress because, in fact, it has captured Sunni villages in northern Iraq. We now have to trust to see whether Maliki can do two things at once, can change his policies with respect to his minorities and begin to bring them back on his side, and at the same time provide a significant defense so he doesn't lose his capital at the same time.
But my concern is that we're introducing into the negotiations with regard to this agreement a new issue.
I'm not introducing the issue, and I don't think the U.S. is going to introduce
Well, we
that
have some
issue.
reports that they are.
Well,
and
they have,
if that's true, does that weaken our position?
I have reason to believe that those reports are, at this point, very tentative kinds of things. I think people are thinking better of this now. I hope they are. My own view is that Iran has to look out for its own interests in Iraq, that it's not up to the U.S. to tele-guide them, to make deals with them. I think it's very important, particularly not at the expense of the issue we're here to discuss today, the nuclear deal.
Let me ask Mr. Singh, Mr. Toby, to respond to that.
What I would say is I think that U.S. officials have tried to clarify that we don't want to see these two issues linked, and I think that's right. I think one of the dangers we have, though, is, again, the sort of perception in the region. And I think that when we are sitting there sort of talking with the Iranians about these issues, it does raise those kind of worries in the region about, are we sort of sitting here and deciding regional issues on a bilateral basis with Iran, which our allies absolutely don't want to see us do, and frankly isn't a wise thing for us to do from a policy perspective. And I agree with Ambassador Pickering. The Iranians see these things as a leverage over us, and we don't want to see them linked at all. I think more importantly, though, what we really don't want to see is we don't want to see any increased Iranian involvement in Iraq. We want to see Iran out of regional conflicts, not further in regional conflicts.
Mr. Toby?
I think greater Iranian involvement in Iraq would be against U.S. interests for its own sake, and I think it would be against U.S. interests in the P5+1 talks. I don't know what the administration is doing with respect to talking to Iran about this.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne. Mr. Kilmer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here. I had a couple questions for the panel. One, I want to get a better understanding of what the barriers are to Iran actually developing a nuclear weapon. Is it knowledge about how to do it? Is it a resource issue? Is it a capability issue? And in the event that a deal is actually reached, is there something that the P5+1 can do to ensure that we keep those barriers up and you don't see an erosion of those barriers?
Well, I guess what I would say is, as I mentioned, there are three elements to a nuclear weapons program. You've got the fuel fabrication, where there is no great challenge before Iran on that side except just doing it. They could produce highly enriched uranium to weapons grade with the technology they have now and with the knowledge they have now. As far as I know, the danger would be detection. The danger would be if they chose to do that, what reaction would that prompt from Israel or from the United States in terms of a military response? On the weaponization research side, it's difficult to say, but what I've seen from the IAEA, what I've sort of seen in news reports, leads me to suggest that they have done a lot of weaponization research, and perhaps, at least on a theoretical basis, they've gone far along on that. On the missiles, on the question of delivery vehicle, which is the third leg, I think what I've seen is a lot spottier. It's not clear to me that they're close yet to an ICBM, to being able to deliver a missile against a faraway foe, or being able to put a nuclear warhead onto even a shorter range missile. And again, that's one of the reasons I'm concerned that a comprehensive agreement might allow them to continue that work and to perfect that leg of the program, even while it pauses some of the other areas where it's further along. But on that question, I would say that what you would really need to get is a update from the Defense Department about exactly where do they stand on that particular leg.
Anything either of you want to add? The other thing I want to get an understanding of, it seems to me that one of the greatest dangers when a nation becomes a nuclear nation is their ability to transfer that knowledge to non-state actors or to non-nuclear nations. As part of this conversation, is there anything that can be done to limit Iran's ability to transfer whatever knowledge they have to non-nuclear states or to non-state actors?
I think returning to understanding these possible military dimensions to the program is also key to that, because it would allow the IAEA to understand who was involved in these programs and what they're doing, what they continue to do even today, and therefore could provide the basis for both the IAEA and perhaps even other nations to keep watch to make sure that those contacts are diminished.
I think there's some good news here that every country that's developed a nuclear weapon, with the exception of Mr. A.Q. Khan in Pakistan, has had two imperatives on its plate. One is to make sure no other country or organization ever gets a nuclear weapon, and putting nuclear weapons in the hands of terrorists, particularly when, should those be exploded, there are pretty good telltales as to where that particular weapon came from, is a very dangerous enterprise. And so the deterrence goes to the fabricator in some ways. And that's something that at least we have some hopes there. The second thing they always have a problem with when they get a nuclear weapon is what they're going to use it for. But we don't want to see that. And here I think it's extremely important that the major effort now being made is to prevent them from getting a weapon. And if that should fail through not getting an agreement, which I think is a very important part of this, then we do face, as I said earlier in my testimony, the question of whether we have a war or an Iranian nuclear weapon. I think that those two outcomes, with the failure of a negotiated effort or the failure of a combination of sanctions and negotiated effort, are things we ought to keep crystal clear in our mind.
If I could just add to that, Congressman, I would say that I think I would be more concerned than Ambassador Pickering on this score, because we have seen Iran share technology with its non-state proxies like Hezbollah on the missile front in a way that has really destabilized the region. Most of the technology that Hezbollah has, that it has actually deployed in the field, in combat, as far as I know, it's obtained from Iran, based on earlier Iranian advances. And I think it's actually more common than Ambassador Pickering suggested that nuclear states do end up sharing nuclear technology with others.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kilmer. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you spending your time with us. If there are any further questions from the committee, they will submit them to you in writing. We would ask that you respond back. Hearing no further business before the House Armed Services Committee, we are adjourned.